Howdy, folks. Hey, this is the old Blackland farmer, Frankie Miller, and you're listening to Thumbin Radio.
Joining me for the entire length of this show is country music legend Frankie Miller. Frankie, let's start with your teen years, when you performed with your group, the Driftin' Texans, on radio stations around your hometown and in Houston. Is that where your musical journey really begins?
Yes, my hometown, Victoria, Texas. It's right south of Houston, and I used to go into Houston all the time, work clubs, and see different people that came into town, you know.
Different artists and different performers.
Yeah, Ernest Tubb, Hank Williams. I saw Hank, I think, 3 times there in Houston. And, you know, different artists. A lot of big clubs there in Houston at that time.
What kind of impression did seeing those artists have on you?
Oh, I was a great fan of them. You know, the music that they had out. That's where I got my groundwork from those guys, Ernest Tubb, Hank Williams, Carl Smith, Lefty Frizzell, and a guy named Floyd Tillman there in Houston.
It always seemed like Houston and Beaumont was a hotbed for country artists to perform. Was that a really good place for someone who wants to perform as a country artist and be a country artist? Was that a good place to grow up?
Yes, very good. Houston was a very good place for country music back in the 50s and early 60s. In the Houston area, the people that lived around there and performed there, it was George Jones, Eddie Nowak, James O'Gwen. I was down there, Floyd Tillman, Hank Lachlan. These are the guys that were, you know, had records out and everything at that time.
Were these your contemporaries? Were these people that you spent a lot of time with?
Yes, we all started pretty well the same time down in the Houston area, except Floyd. Floyd had been in it for years. And Hank Lachlan had too, but George and myself and Eddie Nowak, James O'Gwen, we were all pretty well. We worked down there for Pappy Daly.
Pappy Daly, that's right.
Harold Daly. He got us all on contract record, you know. Kind of took care of us down in the Houston area.
Yeah.
He was a great guy to help country music.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he had a lot to do with the progress of country music. Did you know Eddie Nowak well?
Oh, yeah.
There's
Eddie was a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
I recorded a couple of Eddie's songs, and we worked together in Houston many times. And later on, I worked the road with him, you know. Worked some shows on the road with Eddie. Real good friend of mine. I really liked Eddie. He was a good songwriter.
Yes, he was. You mentioned Hank Lachlan, and for those who are listening, Hank Lachlan, of course, eventually had really big hits with Please Help Me, I'm Falling, and Send Me the Pillow That You Dream On. But he played a part in getting you signed with the Gilt Edge label, which was a subsidiary of 4-Star. How did that come about?
Well, Hank had a radio show in Houston every day at noon. He came on the Hank Lachlan show, and he had was going on a vacation, and he asked me to fill in for him on his show, to do his show for him, you know.
Yeah.
So I stayed up in Houston, done the show, and
did you know at the time when you were filling in for him that this was a great opportunity for you?
Oh, yeah. Sure. It was probably the number one country station there in Houston, which was a big area, of course. And
now, are you talking about KLEE?
KLEE and the Milby Hotel. Yes, and they sponsored a lot of stuff, a lot of country stuff, a lot of country artists. KLEE, I didn't know anybody remembered that but me.
Through Hank, you end up getting signed for 4-Star, or actually Gilt Edge, which was an imprint of 4-Star. Now, this is Don Pierce's label, or this is the label he's running out on the West Coast, right?
Right.
And
yes.
Did you record quite a bit for 4-Star during your time with them?
From 51 and 52, I did, and I had several releases out on Gilt Edge. I had my first record in 1951. Of course, Don Pierce later on was the owner of Starday Records, which I recorded for about 8 years.
Did your records have much success on 4-Star, or I know that the military came calling right about the time after you'd recorded several sessions for 4-Star, but
I was drafted in 1952. At the time, I was recording for Gilt Edge, and when I came back, I got a contract with Columbia Records.
And then once you got the contract with Columbia, was it everything you thought it would be?
Well, I enjoyed it very much. Don Law was A&R man then, and he treated me real well. Yeah, he was a great man. I enjoyed my stint with Columbia very much.
Yeah.
They sent me on a promotional trip all around in the South, and they tried to get me off the ground, and they did. I had some pretty good records on Columbia.
Paint, Powder, and Perfume is another song.
Well, I did an old Columbia record.
Yeah.
Oh, you're the first one I've heard that said anything about that in years.
You had mentioned going on tour in the South. During that day, where was the hotbed circuit? Where was the big circuit? Texas?
Texas has always been one of the hotbeds in country music. And
that seems to be the case even today. It seems like it's still a hotbed for traditional music.
Yes, it is. All the big artists. I saw Hank in 1949, I guess it was. I was in high school, and he was playing in Corpus Christi. My brother was 5 years older than me, and he drove us down there to see Hank. He was a big Ernest Tubb fan, and he was traveling with Ernest at the time, Hank was, before he went on the road with the Drifting Cowboys.
That must have been a show.
Oh, it was. It was at a ballpark. They had a flatbed there at second base, and, of course, chairs all over the infield, and, of course, all of the stands, and it was packed full. And, man, you can't imagine how hot Lovesick Blues was in. Just turn the radio on, you can hear it 4 or 5 times, He came out, I think he sang Lovesick Blues 6 times. They had to get security to get him off stage.
Is that right?
The people I think he'd be singing it still. The people would just holler and holler. I never saw anything like it. He said, "Y'all want to meet Hank?" We said, "Oh, yeah." So he took us back down in the dugout there to meet Hank, and Jimmy Summey played steel for me, and he was a magician. We worked a lot of movie houses at the time. Between the movies,
right.
we'd play maybe for 30 minutes, then they'd show a movie again, then we'd play between the movies all the time. And he had a little magic act that he worked up. We'd play, and then he would have about 10 minutes. And he was showing Hank. He introduced us to Hank, and of course shook hands with Hank. And he was showing Hank some sleight of hand tricks, I have a quarter, and it's gone, and just a few minutes, Hank reached over and he grabbed him by the wrist. He said, Jimmy, he said, these people don't want magic, they want hillbilly. That's the God's truth. That's what he told Jimmy. They don't want magic, they want hillbilly. And they did, boy. That was, of course, back then that's what it was called, hillbilly.
Yeah.
All of Hank's career was called hillbilly,
And there seemed to be some performers who didn't like that label. I know George Jones didn't like the label of hillbilly, but it seemed like that, call it what it is, and there's nothing. There's no shame in being a hillbilly artist, but
no, that's what it was.
That's what it was.
Didn't bother anybody I knew.
Yeah.
In fact, last time I talked to Charlie Walker backstage at Opera, he said, "Man, I wish you'd go back to calling it hillbillies."
I'm so with you. I agree completely.
Yeah.
What is the story behind Blackland Farmer? And I know that you had recorded it several years before Tommy Hill and Don Pierce had heard it at Starday. Did you record Blackland Farmer during your Columbia years or during your 4-star years?
Right after Columbia.
Right after Columbia. Was this you recorded it during a session you financed? Or?
I was between contracts, and I went to Houston, and we recorded Blackland Farmer at Bill Quinn's Gold Star Studio.
So this must have been 56, 57?
It was 1955.
55, okay.
Anyway, I didn't pitch it much to anybody. I kept the tape. I carried it around with me for a couple of years, just bouncing around the car, the master tape. And so I went to Houston. We went to Nashville. I was living in Fort Worth at the time. Had a good friend named Howard Crockett. I don't know if you know who Howard Crockett is.
Honky Tonk Man.
Right, wrote Honky Tonk Man. Wrote a number of songs for Johnny Horton, Sloop with the Bear. And anyway, so we went to Nashville. Crockett had some stuff that he'd been writing kind of in a rock and roll vein. So he took that with him, and we was playing some stuff for Tommy Hill, and wouldn't get much of a rise out of Tommy on that rock and roll sound and stuff. So Crockett said, "Tommy, you want to hear a good country song?" And Tommy said, "Yeah, sure do." And I told Craig, I said, oh, Craig, they don't want to hear nothing country up here now. Craig pointed his long finger at me and said, Miller, go down there and get that Blackline Farmer tape out of the car and bring it up here. So I went down and got it and brought it up. And Tommy put it on the recorder there and played it, and old Craig said, man, he could see Tommy's eyes lit up. So he took it that same day out to Don Pierce at the Starday, and Don really got hooked on it. So they called me in the next day and gave me a contract.
Blackland Farmer seemed to come along at a time when Don was really trying to reestablish Starday as the only purely country label in Nashville.
Don told me himself, he said, Frankie said, you came along with such Blackland Farmer. He said, just at the right time. He said, I just got out of that mess with Pappy Daly. He said, I lost George in the process,
Yeah.
Didn't have George anymore as an artist. He stayed with Pappy, and he said, didn't you come along with Blackland Farmer and just kept Starday in business, he said.
On Blackland Farmer, Glenn Barber?
Uh-huh.
Was he someone you used a lot while you were...
He played lead guitar on the backside of Blackland Farmer song called True Blue.
True Blue.
I see him playing the guitar. Don was a great record man. Well, he knew how to sell records. How to advertise them and sell them.
He was pretty innovative in his techniques.
Oh, very much. And Pappy had a gigantic distributorship there in Houston called South Coast Amusement Company. It was a record distributorship, the biggest one in Texas. And he had another one in Dallas called Big State. So he wasn't hurting for money. He had plenty of money. And I don't know, him and Don didn't see eye to eye on stuff. So Don told me that they split the publishing up. The publishing company, Starday Publishing.
Right.
And he said how they did it, they just flipped the coin and to see which one would pick first, And he said Pappy hadn't kept up with what was going on, selling much.
Right.
And he said I just clobbered him in that picking up songs. He said the first song I picked was A Satisfied Mind.
Whoa.
He said,
wow.
And he picked a lot of the guys that had songs that from around Houston that he knew, but the songs wasn't that good. And Don said, I really done good.
Don knew,
songs.
Don had the experience to know that publishing rights were key.
Yes, he had Starday Records for the publishing. That's where he finally, I think, wound up making all his money when he sold Starday was the publishing. He was a great guy. Boy, he wanted publishing on everything he did. Yeah. Every record you put out, he wanted publishing on.
I know Colonel Tom Parker was that way with Elvis. He wouldn't let Elvis record anything unless they could have the publishing rights.
Sure, that's right. So he'd know how many records you're selling and everything,
What was Pappy Daly like? He always their partnership between Pappy and Don Pierce always struck me as Pappy Daly was the artist management guy, and he had his thumb on the pulse of true talent. And while Don might have had that ability too, Don seemed to be like the strong record guy. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think so. Don was a strong record guy. And Pappy, everybody loved Pappy Daly. Listen, Pappy would do things for you. If you needed a loan, he would loan you some money. He was just great with the artists, Everybody loved Pappy. And, unfortunately, his D label didn't catch on very well,
I actually have a few records with the D label. Some J.
Yeah, I think Eddie recorded some.
He did.
A D.
Yeah.
Eddie,
he had one of my favorite songs of his is "Have Blues Will Travel."
Oh yeah, I remember that.
I love that song, and I've actually got a compilation of country hits, which is the best of D. And Jape Richardson is on there. Eddie's on there. George is on there, of course.
Yeah.
It's there were a lot of really great artists on there.
Yeah, we done the song Eddie wrote real early on Gilt Edge, a song called I Can't Run Away, which wasn't no big song by any means, but it played good for me. And then later on I done a great song he wrote called Too Hot to Handle. Too Hot to Handle.
I love that song.
And I do almost all my shows. I start off with Too Hot to Handle. It's a great stage song.
Take me back to those years on the Hayride. What was life like as a Hayride performer? Because that was right during the peak of the Hayride, and there was so many legendary artists.
Yeah, the Hayride was just right next to the Grand Ole Opry. A lot of people, liked it better.
I'm one of those people as a fan.
I was on the hayride probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years.
What years what time year span was
let's
this?
see, the early 60s, I guess. Well, I was on, I know in 59, I was on it, probably through 62 or 3, something like that. I don't know exactly when it ended, I think around 63 or 4.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
But I was on all those years, and I was on with, of course, Elvis was on there. This was when Elvis was just getting off the ground, just getting started, 55, somewhere along in there. My oldest daughter was just 6 months old, and I was backstage carrying her, and Elvis was coming down the hall there backstage there, and he saw me and said, "Frank, it sure is a pretty little boy you got there." I said, "Well, Elvis, it's a little girl." he said, "Well, can I hold her?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." So he took her, and held her there, and then gave her a little kiss on the head and handed her back to me. And later on, when my daughter was big enough to understand that, I told her about that. She said, "Dad, I can't understand why you didn't get a picture of us." I said, "Well, we didn't have him cell cameras back then with cameras in them,
Right, yeah.
So, but he really tore the hayride up when he come on.
I've thought about this for a long time, and it always seemed to me that as great as Elvis was, and given the success that he had, it always seemed like his success, while it was great for himself and for, in establishing a whole new movement in music, the downside was it really killed hillbilly traditional country music.
He pretty well changed the hayride. We had a good country audience coming there every Saturday night. And when Elvis got so popular, it just about turned into teenagers. Of course, when Elvis left and the teenagers left and our country people had already left.
Oh, wow.
We always said, well, Elvis closed the hayride down.
Did country ever get that original audience back?
To an extent they did. They had some awful good artists. The Browns were popular back then.
Jim Ed and Maxine and Bonnie.
Yeah, they was on the hayride. Of course, Johnny Horton was real popular. Johnny had some big songs.
And Johnny, as I understand it, was it Baby Rocked Her Dolly that he was going to record?
Yes,
Now, how did you go about getting a song that he was going to record for yourself?
Well, it was written by Merle Kilgore, and he wrote it for Johnny, because he had wrote a song that Johnny had out before that. He wrote the song Johnny Reb, and it come right after the Battle of New Orleans, and it didn't do anything like the Battle of New Orleans, of course. And Johnny and Tillman was managing Johnny and Tillman Franks, and they were afraid to do another Merle Kilgore song because the Johnny Reb didn't do what they thought he was going to do. So I was backstage there, and I was fixing to go to Nashville next week and record. And I asked Johnny, I said, "Johnny, have you got any songs that I'm fixing to record? I need some material." He said, "Frankie, I got just a song for you." He said, "Merle wrote it," and he said, "I'm not going to do it." And backstage, he taught me Baby Rocked Her Dolly. I've always liked Baby Rocked Her Dolly. It's one of my favorite songs of my own, that I recorded.
How long were you with Starday? Most of the 60s?
58 through 65, I guess it was.
And then in 65, when you left Starday, what was next on your journey? Another label?
Well, I moved out of Nashville. I wanted to come home. I moved back to Texas, and I was ready to get out of the business, and I did for a long time.
When you say got out of the business, that means no performing, no writing, no nothing.
Nothing, no.
Yeah.
But I recorded for a stop label after Starday. Well, I was on United Artists, When George went with United Artists, we were doing a show in Houston, and Pappy was getting material together, people together for United Artists. They didn't have a country label at the time, so they hired Pappy to put a country label together for them. So Pappy got George, and we was doing a show there in Houston. My contract was up with Starday, and George said, "Oh, man, come on back. Pappy's back there." He said, "I want you to go with United Artists." So George took me back there, and Pappy signed me up that night.
How was your time with United Artists? Was it a productive relationship?
Yes, I had 2 good records out on United Artists. Willie Nelson, The Party Over, was my first record out, and it did real good.
You mentioned Willie Nelson. By the time you were with United Artists, was he pretty well established as a performer, or was he still kind of up and coming?
He wasn't established as an artist yet. He had got a foothold, but he wasn't near anything big like he turned out to be. I took Willie Nelson the first road trip he did out of Nashville. And we laugh about that now, boys.
After your time with the Stop label, which I'm guessing is about late 60s?
Yes,
During the 70s and 80s, what is that when you kind of you put the brakes on everything?
Yeah, I didn't do anything. I cut a session that never was released for Hal Bynum sometime in the 70s there. Hal's been a good friend of mine over the years. I don't know if you know Hal or not.
No, I'm not familiar with Hal.
Hal is a songwriter. Remember a song called "You Picked a Fine Time to Leave Me, Lucille"?
Yeah.
Monster song. He wrote that.
I'll be.
Hal did, and then he wrote a song for Patty Loveless. It was the #1 song called "Chains."
Chains, Shackles and Chains.
That's it. Yeah, he wrote that.
Wow.
He wrote some big songs.
He sure did.
He's an old friend of mine from Fort Worth here.
What are you doing these days? It seems like you've signed with Heart of Texas Records.
Well, I happened to get with the Heart of Texas Records, and which is a pure dyed wool country label, classic country stuff.
We need more of that.
I picked my own songs that I recorded, the musicians and all, for once I can kind of do what I wanted to do. Of course, I always run them by the owner, and he's always been real good for me, good to me, I've got a new CD out. I'm doing personal appearances, mostly all over Texas here, working for Heart of Texas mostly, and just have been having a good time this time around.
That's great.
Really having a good time.
The CD is called
Back When Gas was 30 cents a gallon.
Bluegrass music has always been a genre that hasn't really needed much radio. It hasn't needed much airtime on television. But there is such a strong community of fans and musicians who have kind of taken care of themselves, and through the years they have kind of ensured that bluegrass is gonna succeed, right? And I've always
stay around.
It is right, and I've always wondered, why do you think there's not that same community or family aspect for traditional country?
I think mostly is that everybody kind of went their own way. Bluegrassers all stick together pretty well. When I was on the hayride, our bluegrass act on the hayride was Jimmy Martin, and they stuck with their music through thick and thin. They didn't, when rock and roll hit big, with a lot of the country guys, tried to do rock and roll stuff and all this stuff. Boy, the bluegrassers didn't. They stuck with bluegrass and just wrote it out,
Do you think
that's one of the things.
For the country artists that moved on to rock and roll, perhaps there's a chance that they weren't maybe true country artists?
Well, they went with the flow, I think, The money at the time was in the rock and roll, and the labels were they wasn't particularly wanting to record anybody country, So they kind of went with the rock and roll type thing.
And why do you think you never had any interest in going rock and roll?
I love country music too much.
Yeah.
I get frightened mad, boy, when they start down in country music. Me and George Jones was sitting, it's been several years ago, and somebody come in bad mouth country music. Boy, George got all over him.
Yeah.
He loved country music too, boy. He was just such a good friend of mine, George was.
You've heard of Naomi Judd, right, of the Judds?
Yes,
Yeah, well, she wrote a letter to the newspaper here in Nashville is called the Tennessean, and she wrote a letter to the Tennessean, and I was so excited to see this, but let me just read you a little bit of this. She says, George Jones is to country music what the Beatles are to pop, the Rolling Stones to rock, yet the Country Music Television Award Show allowed only a by-the-way mention of his death. They paid no tribute to him whatsoever. True country music fans are a loyal bunch and are passionate about our roots and our heritage. But yet, every year, country music television includes artists of unrelated genres, many of whom some country music fans don't even know. And I suggest the CMT Award Show change its name to the Multi-Genre Award Show featuring artists under 30. Of course, she acknowledges that Speaking Out will probably forever ban her on CMT. But
I like it. I like that letter.
Yeah, she says, but I'm tired of folks messing with my country music, especially when it involves my dear friend George Jones. And that's one of the reasons I started Thumbin Radio, Frankie, was I grew up on traditional country music. I'm a a poor boy from Arkansas. I live in Nashville, Tennessee now. But when I grew up, that was the music that we listened to. That's just what it was. And
that's right.
And I don't understand why it seems like the people that are running country music today have such a they're almost they don't have a sense of what the genre is. It seems like they're wanting to be rock and roll.
They don't even know what country music is all about.
They haven't got a clue, and
a lot of them, they really don't.
And a lot of them are coming out and they're being critical of people before them, the artists whose shoulders they stand on, and it kills me. And I'll tell you this: since I started Thumbin Radio, there are listeners from all over the world who tune in, even in Sweden, and you probably know this, how big it is in Europe. But I get emails from people all the time just saying, "Thank you so much. We've been looking for something like this," and
they really do. They still like true country music.
They do. They do.
I was over in England here a while back, and the people lined up there. They bought every CD I had, all my pictures. They just love country music. They really do.
What is performing like for you now? Do you perform quite a bit? Are you out and about with your music?
Yes, yeah.
Are you just enjoying life these days?
I really am, yeah. And my CDs have done good with Heart of Texas. They're selling, I'm not talking about they're reaching anything high in the charts, but I'm talking about the country music people are buying them.
It sounds like there's a really strong hotbed of traditional country music action in Texas.
Yeah, Heart of Texas has really helped. Their headquarters in Brady, Texas, and they have a real nice museum there, country music museum.
Yeah.
With stuff from everybody. But they're a country music label. They're a classic country music label.
I can't thank you enough for giving me an hour of your time. It means a lot to me, and I can't wait to get it in the ears of all my listeners.
You're welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.